What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Something important may be changing across several layers of the Russia-Ukraine war at the same time, because on one side, the Institute for the Study of War says Russian forces are unlikely to seize Ukrainian so-called fortress belt in 2026, even as a new Russian push appears to be underway. While on another side, both Moscow and Kyiv are claiming gains in different frontline villages, which tells you that the battlefield is active, fluid, and politically sensitive. And then, above all of that, Ukraine is escalating long-range pressure on Russian oil infrastructure so heavily that Reuters says around 40% of Russia's oil export capacity is currently inactive from the combined effect of port attacks, pipeline damage, and tanker seizures. This is something what we guys talked in more details in our previous episode. If you missed it, go ahead and watch it after watching this video. Add to that also the report that the Pentagon has reportedly weighed redirecting some Ukrainian-related air defense supply to the Middle East. And then Volodymyr Zelenskyy's defense cooperation move with Saudi Arabia, and ultimately reports that the Kremlin is denying that Vladimir Putin is strongly asking oligarchs to help stabilize the budget after stories emerged about a 100 billion ruble pledge from Suleiman Kerimov. And, well, after all that, you can see why this no longer looks like just like a simple frontline update today. It looks more like one of those moments when battlefield pressure, war financing, sanctions, diplomacy, and the global security market all start colliding in the same 24-hour cycle. Let's talk about all of these things right now. Here is the most valiant part of the story, because if you only read a few headlines, you might come away with the impression that Russia is simply building momentum and that Ukraine is just trying to survive another wave. But the deeper picture is more complicated than that. Institute for the Study of War's March 26 assessment says Russian forces are unlikely to seize Ukraine's fortress belt in 2026, which is a very important judgment because the fortress belt is the backbone of Ukraine's defensive geography in the Donetsk theater. And if Russia cannot break that belt this year, then even a noisy offensive with local gains may still fall short of the kind of strategic breakthrough that Moscow needs. And this is exactly where most people go wrong, because they see offensive activity and assume it automatically means offensive success, when in reality, a new push can be politically important, visually impressive, and still strategically insufficient. The Russian military can intensify pressure, shift reserves, increase drone and glide bomb activity, and even open new local points of tension. But if the actual defensive architecture around the fortress belt continues to hold, then the question becomes not whether Russia is attacking, because clearly it is, but whether it can turn this pressure into a result that changes the course of the entire 2026. Right now, the available reporting suggests the answer is still very uncertain, and that uncertainty is a major story in itself, because Russia has already spent years and enormous resources trying to convert grinding pressure into a decisive breakthrough. Now here is where it gets interesting, because this strategic ceiling also helps explain why we are seeing so much parallel activity outside the direct line of contact. If you are truly confident that your ground campaign would deliver a clean and fast result, you would not be as sensitive to oil revenue disruptions, diplomatic repositioning, budget anxieties, and Western supply reallocations. But if the battlefield remains difficult, then every other arena suddenly matters so much more. That is why the Fortress Belt story is not just a military map story. It is the framework for understanding all the other stories we will cover today, because it tells you that the war is still being decided in a zone where Russia can apply pressure, but not easily achieve closure. And once you understand that, the next chapter becomes even more important, because the local frontline claims start to look less like isolated tactical events and way more like pieces of a larger contest over momentum and endurance. Also guys, if you want some bonus content like uncensored combat footage from Ukraine, you'll be able to find it as always on our Patreon. The link is down below. Thanks so much. Let's continue. In just a second, I will reveal something most people overlook, because the Reuters report about both sides claiming gains may sound like a routine just fog of war item, but it actually says a lot about where the war is right now. Reuters reported that Russia's defense ministry said it captured Sheviakivka in the northeastern Kharkiv region near the Russian border, while Ukraine's 95th Separate Assault Brigade said it retook Berezove in the southern Dnipropetrovsk region. Reuters could not independently verify either claim, but the combination is what matters, because it tells you that even while Russia is trying to frame the moment as one of the sustained initiative, Ukraine is still capable of recovering ground in at least some sectors and contesting the narrative of momentum. And that's not all, because the Kyiv Independent added a more detailed Ukrainian angle to this broader picture, reporting that Ukrainian forces said they regained ground in the Alexandriivka sector where Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions converge, and that over roughly 2 months of operations beginning on January 29th. They said that they had regained approximately 440 square kilometers and liberated a total of at least 9 settlements, while Russian losses in that sector in this part of the war were put at 3,676 personnel, including more than 2,600 killed and more than 1,000 wounded and 11 captured. Wartime statistics from either side always needs to be treated carefully, but even taking that into consideration, the significance is still very clear. Ukraine is not simply waiting for a Russian spring-summer offensive to unfold. It is still conducting localized counterattacks and shaping operations designed to show that the line is not just one-directional. This is exactly what changed everything in how we should read the day's battlefield coverage. Because when one side claims a village in Kharkov and the other claims a village in Dnipropetrovsk, the story is not really about who won the headline contest for just a few hours. The deeper story is that Russia is trying to create a broad sense of advancing pressure from multiple directions, including talk of buffer zones near Kharkov and Sumy, while Ukraine is trying to show that it can still punch back, retake tactically useful positions, and keep the front line from becoming psychologically just one-sided. That is why these village-level stories matter more than just appear to matter. They're small in geographic scale, but large in signaling value, especially when outside audiences, foreign governments, and financial markets are watching for clues about whether the year belongs to Russian momentum or Ukrainian resilience. At this point, you might be wondering why this matters so much if neither side has collapsed and the war still looks like just a long contest. And the answer is that, well, these small frontline signals interact directly with decision-making abroad. If donors, investors, and allied governments conclude that Russia is on an unstoppable march, that changes political behavior. But if they conclude that Ukraine can still hold key lines and create pain for Russia elsewhere, guess what? That changes political behavior as well. And that takes us directly into the next chapter, because while Russia is trying to generate battlefield pressure and momentum, Ukraine appears to be answering in a place that the Kremlin simply cannot easily hide, which is the oil system that keeps the entire war budget alive. Now here is where things get tricky, because the Reuters reporting on Ukraine's strikes against Russian oil infrastructure is one of the most important strategic stories of the day. And not just because of the physical disruption, but because of the logic behind it. Reuters reported that President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Ukraine was applying its own sanctions through long-range strikes on Russian energy infrastructure after international sanctions pressure eased in connection with the Iranian war. That line obviously matters because it tells you Kyiv believes some of the external economic pressure on Moscow has loosened at exactly the wrong moment. And so Ukraine itself is simply trying to substitute military pressure where sanctions pressure has weakened significantly. And here's the part that shocked me personally the most, because Reuters says about 40% of Russia's oil export capacity is currently completely inactive due to combined effects of port attacks, pipeline damage, and tanker seizures. That is an extraordinary figure, especially when paired with the report that Ust-Luga loadings have been halted since Wednesday completely, with one source saying operations might not even resume before mid-April, while Primorsk had only partially resumed. Leningrad region governor Alexander Dozhdenko called the attack, which had continued since March 22nd, he called them unprecedented. Even the state of so-called force majeure, nationwide emergency in plain English, has been unofficially declared in Russia because of this whole entire oil situation. And so when you start hearing words like force majeure, nationwide emergency in connection with these oil exports, and then in unprecedented in connection with repeated drone pressure, you're no longer just looking at symbolic harassment. You are looking at operational disruption with very real budget implications. But there's still one more piece to this story, because the pressure does not stop at the ports themselves. Reuters also reported that damage at Ust-Luga could force refineries in Kirishi, Yaroslavl, Moscow, and Ryazan to cut runs, with those 4 facilities together processing about 55 million metric tons of crude annually. while Ust-Luga handles about 18 million tons of fuel oil a year. And then there is a Novatek angle, because Reuters said Novatek halted operations at its Ust-Luga complex after multiple attacks, affecting gas condensate processing and naphtha exports. The site, by the way, processed 8 million tons of gas condensate in 2025 and has 3 processing units with a combined annual capacity of 9 million tons. That means the story is no longer simply that one terminal was damaged. The story is that a wider chain of Russian export and refining logistics is being stressed at multiple points at once. Now imagine all of this from Moscow's perspective. Russia is already dealing with budget strains, slower growth, sanctions enforcement risks, and the war now in its 5th year. And then, just when higher oil prices from the Iran conflict might have offered at least some kind of relief, Ukraine starts hitting the Baltic system in ways that interrupt physical flow and potentially erase part of that financial upside. That is why this is not just an energy story, it is a war finance story, it is a pressure on the budget story. And it becomes even more serious when you place it next to the next chapter, because all of this is happening while the United States is reportedly reconsidering where some of its own air defense attention should go. Here's something I was not personally expecting, because the Kyiv's Independent March 27th article may end up being remembered less for one dramatic battlefield line and more for what it says about the strategic attention. The report says that the Pentagon is considering redirecting military aid intended for Ukraine to the Middle East, with the Washington Post cited as saying that air defense interceptor missiles under the prioritized Ukraine requirements list, or PURL, could be affected. A Ukrainian official said that Kyiv is concerned, while NATO spokesperson Alison Hart told European Pravda that everything allies and partners paid for through this PURL had been delivered or continues to be delivered. That contrast is very telling, because it suggests official reassurance on one side and then real anxiety on the other. And just when I thought I had figured it all out, the numbers made the story even more serious. The same Kyiv Independent report says Moscow launched nearly 1,000 attack drones against Ukraine over a 24-hour period between March 23rd and 24th. in what appeared to be one of the potentially largest aerial assaults of the full-scale war. That means that the air redirection conversation is not taking place in a quiet moment. It is happening during a period when Ukraine's need for air defense remains the highest. So when President Donald Trump says, "We do that all the time," referring to moving ammunition from one country to another, the problem for Kyiv is not just what he means today, but what planners inside Ukraine now have to assume about future reliability. Now let's take a step further, because the same Kyiv Independent article also said a Shadow Fleet tanker Altura carrying 140,000 tons of oil from Novorossiysk under the Sierra Leone flag was struck in the Black Sea, with damage to the deck, bridge and the engine room, although all 27 crew members were reportedly unharmed. The vessel reportedly transported Russian oil to India and Georgia and had been sanctioned by Ukraine and Switzerland since 2025, and then by the United Kingdom since 2026. This matters because it shows that the battle around Russian energy flows is not limited to fixed infrastructure like Primorsk or Ust-Luga. It also extends into the Shadow Fleet ecosystem that Moscow relies on to bypass sanctions and keep those exports moving. There is a surprising twist to all this, though, because the Middle East story is not only a threat for Ukraine, it is also an opening. If Washington's influence is stretched and Gulf countries face their own drone and missile dangers, then Ukraine's battlefield experience suddenly becomes a tradable asset in global security politics. And that brings us to the next chapter, because Volodymyr Zelenskyy's Saudi move now looks a lot less symbolic and a lot more like a calculated attempt to turn Ukrainian wartime expertise into diplomatic leverage, technological cooperation, and potentially even financial support. But that's only half the story, because the Saudi angle is much more interesting than a simple ceremonial visit. Reuters reported that Ukraine and Saudi Arabia signed a defense cooperation agreement that, in Zelenskyy's words, lays the foundation for future contracts, technological cooperation and investment. Al Jazeera, also citing Reuters, said Zelenskyy described it as an important arrangement ahead of his meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and said that the cooperation could be quote-unquote mutually beneficial. Saudi Arabia had not confirmed the pact at the time of that reporting, but the message from Kyiv was very clear. Ukraine wants a foothold in Gulf security cooperation at a moment when the region is under direct pressure from Iranian drone and missile activity. Now here's potentially the game changer, because Reuters says Ukraine has deployed more than 220 experts to the Middle East to help counter drone attacks on energy infrastructure, while Al Jazeera reported that Riyadh has intercepted hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles from Iran since the United States and Israel first struck Tehran on February 28, including at least 6 missiles intercepted on Friday alone. That means Ukraine is not arriving in the Gulf as a beggar with nothing to offer. It is arriving as a country with 4 years of real, practical experience in air defense adaptation, drone interception, and layered response under constant pressure. Here was what you might not expect, because Reuters also reported through Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha that Ukraine is finalizing several security agreements with Middle Eastern countries, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, with talks also involving Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan and Amman, centered on unmanned technologies and military cooperation. Sybiha even said he had been invited to China and expected a visit within 2 months, which tells you Kyiv is trying to diversify its diplomatic map at a moment when Western support feels less automatic than it once did. So the Saudi agreement is not just about Saudi Arabia. It is part of a wider Ukrainian effort to convert battlefield know-how into a broader security network beyond the traditional Euro-Atlantic frame. And that's where the old assumptions start to fall apart, because for much of this war the standard model was very simple. The West funds and equips Ukraine. Ukraine resists Russia. And then the rest of the world is just mostly background noise. That model is no longer enough. Now you have Gulf states under Iranian pressure, Europe worried about sanctions leakage and shadow fleets, Washington consumed by multiple theaters, and Ukraine looking for ways to turn its defense industrial knowledge into some kind of strategic currency. This does not mean Saudi Arabia or Gulf will replace the West, no, not at all, not yet. But it does mean Ukraine is trying to build a second layer of strategic relevance. And that is a very smart move in a world where support is no longer guaranteed to flow in a just straight line like it used to be. And once you see that, the final major chapter of today's briefing becomes even more revealing, because while Ukraine tries to just monetize experience and expand partnerships, Russia, well, or better say Putin in particular, may now be leaning harder on its own wealthy elite to help carry the cost of the prolonged war. But here's the catch, because the Reuters report from Moscow may be one of the clearest windows we have into how sensitive Russia's financial position has become. Reuters said that the Kremlin denied reports that Vladimir Putin had asked leading businessmen, oligarchs, to donate money to stabilize Russia's finances as the war in Ukraine drags on into 5th year. Whenever Kremlin denies something, well, you already know, most likely it's true. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said it was not true that Putin made such a request. But then he also said that one participant had offered to donate a very large sum of money to the state, and that Putin welcomed the initiative. According to the Bell, as quoted by Reuters, this person is billionaire Suleiman Kerimov, pledged 100 billion rubles, or about $1.2 billion. Just like this. Take it. Why not? I mean, so this is a very awkward denial now, because it denies compulsion while confirming that large voluntary money has indeed been discussed. And here is where most people would just give up too early, because they hear denial and just move on. When the more interesting question is why this topic is sensitive enough to need a denial in the first place. Reuters notes that Russia is running a budget deficit and facing an economic slowdown, even if higher oil prices from the Iranian war could create a potentially temporary windfall. Kyiv Post, citing the Bell, went further and reported that at a March 26 closed-door meeting, Putin demanded oligarchs to throw money into a war effort, that Rosneft head Igor Sechin floated the idea even of federal loan military bonds, and that Putin made it very clear that the Kremlin intended to continue the war, with just one source saying that the message was essentially, "We will fight, we will go to the borders of Donbass, I need your money, I demand your money." Kyiv Post also said at least 2 oligarchs agreed to make voluntarily contributions. Reuters could not independently verify all those extra claims and details, so they should be just, well, I guess to say, treated carefully. But together, the two reports still paint a clear picture of elite financial mobilization becoming just a serious issue. The next part is crucial, so guys, please pay close attention. Because even if you take the Kremlin's version at just face value and assume that this was a patriotic, spontaneous offer from one businessman rather than a direct demand from Putin, I mean, yeah, $1 billion, why not? That still tells you something very important. It tells you that Russia's elite understands that the state needs help, or at least wants visible financial solidarity, at a time when war costs are rising and normal budget comfort has eroded. In a low-pressure wartime economy, you do not get headlines about one of the country's most prominent billionaires publicly, or at least semi-publicly, pledging 100 billion rubles like nothing, right after a closed-door Kremlin meeting. I mean, that is not the headline of a system feeling relaxed. That is the headline of a system trying to project confidence while quietly tightening the circle of obligation. And here is the real reason this matters. Because this budget story connects directly back to every earlier chapter. If Russia cannot quickly force a military breakthrough in the fortress belt, if Ukraine keeps disrupting oil logistics around Ust-Luga and Primorsk, if Shadow Fleet routes stay under pressure, and if outside support for Kyiv remains uncertain but not absent, then the war becomes more expensive not only in military terms, but in elite political terms inside Russia as well. The Kremlin can still endure a lot, and nobody should underestimate that, but endurance is not free. And once a regime starts needing highly visible, voluntarily billionaire patriotism, it means that the cost of continuation is being felt in places Moscow would rather never discuss too openly. Whew, guys, please subscribe if you want more daily briefings like this video, because these stories are moving fast, and the most important part is usually not the headline itself, but how all these headlines connect. Don't forget the Patreon link is down below. Have a good weekend. Thanks so much. See you on Tuesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims are all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.